All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for ARCCA's learning session webinar in partnership with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, or APEN, and Redlining Institute. My name is Julia Kim, and I'm with the Local Government Commission, which serves as the coordinator for ARCCA, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. I know we have a handful of folks still trickling in, but I'm going to go ahead and get started since we have a lot of great content to feature today. So quick overview of today's agenda. I'll first provide a brief overview of ARCCA, or the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, for folks who are not familiar with us. Then on to the featured presentation for today on centering equity and climate adaptation and resilience. We'll be sure to save some time for a Q&A panel discussion, and we'll wrap up with a few brief closing remarks. A few logistical items to cover before we get started. Everyone will be muted except for our panelists due to the large number of expected participants, but we do encourage you to connect your audio through your computer or phone so that you can use the hand raising feature to ask questions and engage in the discussion after the presentation. You can also submit a question or share your thoughts through the Zoom platform at any time, either through the Q&A portal or the chat modules, and we'll be sure to take a look and verbalize any comments and questions that come in. And as a quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll make that available on the ARCCA website along with the presentation, and we'll share that out through email with all the participants and registrants. So again, for those who aren't familiar with ARCCA, we're a statewide network of regional climate collaboratives working to advance adaptation at the state level, while also working to move the needle on adaptation locally and regionally. ARCCA provides regular and timely newsletters and alerts to its members to stay up to date on the latest news, funding opportunities, events, and resources. We also create opportunities for adaptation practitioners to come together and exchange knowledge, best practices, and lessons learned. We've played a leading role in supporting the formation of new regional climate collaboratives. You can expect to see a new Inland Southern California Climate Collaborative come online in January, which will cover San Bernardino, Riverside, and Imperial counties, which is really exciting. And we're also working with a few key stakeholders to see if we can form a regional collaborative in the San Joaquin Valley. And lastly, we serve as a streamlined channel for state agencies to engage with local and regional stakeholders while working to ensure that regional considerations, needs, and priorities are appropriately reflected in state planning and funding guidelines. Our current membership of regional collaboratives covers 7 regions throughout California, as you can see here. The Inland Southern California Climate Collaborative would occupy these 3 counties that you can see. As noted, LGC does serve as the coordinator, and then the Governor's Office of Planning and Research serves as ARCCA's state liaison. And our network also includes a number of leading organizations, companies, and academic institutions working throughout the state to advance adaptation. And now to introduce our speakers. So excited, Ami and Sona, for you both joining us today. Ami Raval is a second-generation South Asian American born and raised on the East Coast. Her personal experiences have supported her awareness of how inequalities in the workplace, as well as the built and natural environment, influence community health. Through her role at APEN, she offers an environmental justice and health equity lens to climate and energy policy in California. She previously worked with the Natural Resources Defense Council on research and advocacy addressing the environmental and occupational health impacts of extreme heat due to climate change. Ami graduated with an MS in Environmental Health Sciences from UC Berkeley School of Public Health, and in her free time, she enjoys hiking and camping. Oops. And we'll also hear from Sona Manat, who comes to us from New Orleans and recently moved to the Bay Area to work on environmental equity issues. She became interested in environmental equity after witnessing the disproportionate environmental burdens that communities of color face in New Orleans, especially after Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil spill. Sona interned at several environmental nonprofits throughout law school and realized that she wanted to pursue a career in public interest environmental law. As environmental equity manager, she looks forward to advocating for environmental equity and learning how to effectively empower communities of color. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you both, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Great. Thank you, Julia, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Ami Raval, and I am a senior policy researcher with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, or APEN. And if folks don't know, APEN is a grassroots environmental justice organization working to empower Asian American immigrant and refugee communities, specifically in the Bay Area, in Oakland, Chinatown, as well as in Richmond. And we do that through local organizing, civic engagement, and the work that I really focus on is policy work. So with that, we are excited to present Ensuring Equitable and Data-Driven Climate Adaptation Policy, and sharing 2 reports that Sona and I have worked on. So just to go over the flow for today, next slide. We're starting with a welcome. We're going to share the key outcomes that we hope you all get out of this webinar. We'll open then with Greenlining's Making Equity Real report, and then move into APEN's Mapping Resilience report overview. And then we'll invite questions and answers and go into close. So just to outline what we hope that you leave today's webinar with in the hour that we have together, we really hope that you will receive education and co-learning, particularly the key takeaways from both of the reports that our organizations have worked on, and using those reports as a foundation for policy strategies to think about how we can advance equity in climate adaptation and resilience efforts, specifically in California. So before we dive into the reports, we really want to ground the group in the values with which APEN and Greenlining are doing this work with. And that really centers around our vision for community resilience. And so the image on the left is from our partners at the California Environmental Justice Alliance as part of their work on transformative climate communities. And this gives us one picture of what resilient, healthy, thriving communities look like. And so I invite you to kind of notice some of the elements that you see in the neighborhood. For us, achieving this vision requires more than just strengthening built infrastructure and protecting the natural environment, although those are integral. It really centers communities, particularly those that are on the front lines of the crisis, who have been historically overburdened by the extractive economy and that we know will be most impacted by future disasters. And so in the short term, it means preparing neighborhoods and people to cope and respond to this new climate reality. And in the longer term, it's fundamentally about building power and addressing underlying systemic inequalities that are oppressing low-income communities and communities of color, which kind of evokes the image on the right, naming system change, not climate change. And so we really wanted to start here because our reports outline strategies towards achieving this vision. And so with that grounding, I'm going to transition to Sona to share more about their report.
Thanks, Ami. Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Sona Monat, and I'm a senior policy analyst and program manager at the Greenlining Institute. Greenlining is a racial and economic justice public policy organization. We do statewide advocacy in California, and we're based in Oakland. Greenlining is a made-up word, so our organization tries to address the harmful impacts that redlining policies created in communities of color, especially Black communities. And I'll be getting into a little bit of that in the presentation. We have several policy teams that try to undo the harmful impacts that redlining created in our communities. I'm on the environmental equity team, and we work to reduce poverty and pollution at the same time in low-income communities of color in California. And so the presentation today that I wanted to share is on a report that we recently published on how to make equity real in climate adaptation and resilience efforts. And what does it mean how do we make equity real? Well, I'm sure a lot of you know that equity is a pretty popular buzzword these days, which is great. But as it becomes more and more mainstream, there's a risk that equity can turn into an empty promise if we don't have a strategy on how do we actually make equity real and achieve that promise. Because we want to ensure that equity is not just a commitment, but that it's an actual practice. And so today, I'm excited to share a framework with all of you, one that we've been developing for over 2 years on how to make equity real in climate adaptation and resilience policies and programs. And so first, just wanted to share a quick overview of the presentation. I'll first share why social equity matters in climate adaptation and resilience to really ground us. Second, I'll introduce our Making Equity Real framework. And finally, I'll offer some examples of how the framework can be applied in policy work. So let's start with why social equity matters in climate adaptation and resilience. So for over 2 decades, the Redlining Institute and the Asian Pacific Environmental Network have worked to advance racial equity for low-income communities of color in California. Why do our organizations care about climate issues? Well, race, even more than class, is the #1 indicator for where toxic and polluting facilities are located today. These facilities are predominantly located in low-income communities of color, and as a result, our communities face many environmental injustices as well as other socioeconomic challenges. And since climate change exacerbates all of these threats, low-income communities are often hit hardest by climate disasters and have the fewest resources to adapt. But as we know, these injustices did not just show up today. They're the result of generations of discriminatory policies that have created severe economic and environmental burdens in low-income communities of color. The location of Black and Brown communities near sources of pollution comes from discriminatory government policy from the 1930s, which we all know as redlining. In the 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression, many families were struggling to make ends meet and were defaulting on their mortgages. And so in response, federal housing agencies began issuing government-backed mortgages to help post-war families build wealth through the Depression. However, not all families received help. To figure out how to distribute the mortgages, government worked with bankers and realtors to create maps to identify which neighborhoods to invest in based on credit risk. And Oakland and other East Bay neighborhoods were one of those areas, and I have a map, a redlining map of those communities on this slide. And so they created a grading system based on several factors, like quality of housing, but the primary indicator of credit risk was race. The neighborhoods were graded based on a color code that you can see on this map. Green meant best, blue meant still desirable, yellow meant definitely declining, and red meant hazardous. And areas that were redlined were seen as credit risks because of the presence of people of color. And this is where the term redlining comes from. And just to illustrate how egregious this policy was, between 1932 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion of loans. More than 98% of that went to white families. And this lack of investment for decades in communities of color has led to the extreme wealth inequality that we see today along race lines. But redlining didn't just impact economic conditions. As people of color were locked into crowded inner city areas, these communities were selected as dumping grounds for urban sources of pollution and contamination. Highways were also used as a way to separate Black neighborhoods from white ones, and were often constructed directly through communities of color, exposing them to serious transportation pollution and other negative health impacts. In California, a 2018 analysis done by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment shows that 89% of people in the poorest, most polluted, disadvantaged communities are people of color. And on this slide, I have 2 maps that I wanted to compare. One is the East Bay redlining map on the left, and the other one is a current CalEnviro screen map on the right. It's of the same areas in the East Bay. And the map on the right, the CalEnviro screen map, identifies the most impacted communities that are most impacted by pollution and other socioeconomic conditions. And you'll see that the red and orange communities on the right clearly track to the same communities that were redlined over 80 years ago. And while redlining is one government-sanctioned policy that created inequities along race lines, it's not the only one. Since the founding of this country, on the genocide of Native people, to slavery, to Jim Crow laws, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, to Japanese internment, and to ICE detention centers today, race has always determined the winners and losers in this country. Centuries of racist, discriminatory public policies essentially put handcuffs on Black and Brown communities from being able to accumulate wealth, power, and resources. And it's important to remember that this history wasn't just created by a few bad actors, but that these were all deliberate public policy decisions that were carried out by federal, state, and local government institutions. Government created these injustices, but government can also play an important role in addressing them. And that's the message that we want to bring to our policymakers, that as we move forward to develop new policies, we have to acknowledge that race-based policies created and continue to perpetuate the racial inequities we see today. And what we see today is that the cumulative effect of redlining and other discriminatory policies have resulted in segregation, disinvestment, and poverty and pollution in neighborhoods of color. And all of this has led to a climate gap, where poor people and people of color are disproportionately and unequally impacted by climate change and have the fewest resources to adapt. And this is what all these headlines are illustrating. For instance, low-income communities often lack the financial well-being that can serve as a lifeline during climate disasters, like having access to a car or living near safe transit options to escape a climate disaster, or having enough savings in case you're displaced or experiencing unemployment after a climate disaster. And so as we think about creating climate adaptation and resilience policies, it's critical that we center equity in them to protect our most impacted communities from climate disasters. And to center equity in climate adaptation and resilience, we need strategies that provide comprehensive multiple benefits to impacted communities. Because as we just saw, climate disasters don't simply impact the natural environment where we live, but can exacerbate any existing health, environmental, and other socioeconomic inequities. And so the strategies that we want to see are ones that build the resilience to physical environments, create better health outcomes, enhance economic opportunities, reduce exposure to pollutants, and continuously engage and empower communities throughout every phase of planning to implementation. And so now I'd like to share how our report can help get us there. So in developing the guidebook, and we call it a guidebook because it's essentially a guide on how to make equity real in policies and programs, we first did a landscape analysis, and we assessed over 30 different climate adaptation and resilience grant programs and policies to see how they currently advance equity. And we did this because we wanted to get a baseline for how equity is currently showing up in different climate adaptation and resilience efforts in California. And what we found is that the majority of initiatives did not meaningfully advance equity. And by that, I mean the initiatives lack robust community engagement to inform the development and implementation of a policy or program. They didn't advance multiple benefits like the ones listed in the previous slide, or they didn't target funding to historically marginalized communities. And overall, most of the initiatives that we reviewed included a few equity elements, but as a whole, equity was not baked into the foundation of the effort. And the concern here is that when policies and programs and investments are developed and implemented without an intentional consideration of equity, racial inequities are likely to be forgotten, reinforced, or in some cases exacerbated. And so we created a scoring system for all of the programs and policies we reviewed, and I have some examples up here. And while these examples are specific to California, I think they can be applied to any sort of work that we're doing. And you can refer to the guidebook to see the entire analysis that we conducted for all of the policies and programs. So knowing this, how do we intentionally and meaningfully center equity and adaptation and resilience? Well, if there's one thing that you walk away from this presentation with, it's these 4 steps that I'm about to share. So for any climate adaptation policy or program or other effort, equity has to be embedded first in the goals, vision, or values. This means, how is equity described in the context of the overall goal of the policy or program? Is it a core component or is it missing? Second, equity has to show up in the process. And by this we mean, how does the effort propose to deliver outcomes with equity as a focus? How are decisions made or influenced by communities with less political power or voice? Third, it has to show up in implementation. So how does implementation lead to actual equitable outcomes? And fourth, it has to show up in analysis. And this really gets to how are we measuring the equity progress in our program. So equity has to show up in all 4 categories to create the strongest outcomes for communities. And we have to be explicit about it. Because again, equity is not just a commitment, it has to be a practice. And so now I'll go into each of these 4 steps and share some examples about how to make equity real in each of them. So for goals, equity can't just be a talking point. If a climate adaptation resilience effort is serious about creating equitable outcomes, it has to make that explicit in the goals of the effort. And a good example of this is the Los Angeles Countywide Sustainability Plan. The plan outlines what local governments and stakeholders can do to improve the well-being of every community in the county while reducing damage to the natural environment and adapting to a changing climate. And the whole plan is organized around 12 goals that provide a shared vision for sustainable Los Angeles County. I really like this example because equity is not one of the 12 goals, but it's built into almost all of the 12 goals. And that's what we want to see, because by weaving equity into all of the sustainability goals, the county will be able to tackle multiple existing inequities that communities are facing. And I have some examples on the slide about how the different goals advance equity. For example, goal number 1 is to have resilient and healthy community environments where residents thrive in place. And the goal explicitly says that the county will protect low-income communities and communities of color from pollution and reduce health and economic inequities. Goal number 3 talks about equitable and sustainable land use and development without displacement, which is another very important equity consideration. Goal number 8 talks about creating a more safe, reliable, and affordable transportation system, and specifically considering residents with limited mobility options that can impact access to economic opportunities. And the last goal I want to share is number 11, which focuses on inclusive, transparent, and accountable governance that facilitates participation in sustainability efforts, especially by disempowered communities. And again, I really like this example because equity shouldn't be siloed into one goal, but should show up in all of the goals, because communities require multifaceted, intersectional strategies to build resilience. Because a community that's protected from flooding, but is under the threat of displacement, is not truly resilient. So in the second step, equity has to be built into the processes of an effort to ensure that communities have opportunities to influence and drive decisions. And a good example of an equity-centered process is Los Angeles County's Measure A, which passed in 2016 and aims to provide safe, clean neighborhood, parks, and beaches for Los Angeles County. As part of the process, the Board of Supervisors approved a county-wide comprehensive parks and recreation needs assessment to identify park need in the county. And the map on this screen shows every area's park need, with green being very low and red being very high. And the entire process included a lot of resident engagement, including workshops for the over 178 study areas where residents could review what kinds of parks were in their neighborhood, and also create a list of projects that they wanted to see in their parks and be able to prioritize them. And the workshops and the outreach materials were also available in multiple different languages to make it accessible to residents who didn't speak English. And now, the data from the assessment can be used to equitably allocate funds in high park need areas, while also addressing the specific needs that each community has that came up through the workshops. Moving on to step 3. The next step is ensuring that implementation of the effort actually leads to equitable outcomes. This requires understanding community identified needs and developing implementation strategies that respond to those needs to increase resilience. I want to share an example of an effort that's centered around community identified needs. And so an organization called PODER, which stands for the People Organizing to Demand Environmental and Economic Rights. They're a Latinx base building and environmental justice organization in San Francisco. And they collaborated with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission on the project. So PODER created a new community farm on SFPUC-owned land. And they converted a 5-acre area that was next to a park into an urban community farm. And this farm provides a space for community members to come together to grow their own food and medicine. The park and the farm are important resilience assets in the community. And so community members created a survey and went door to door to ask residents about their priorities, concerns, and ideas for building resilience that the farm and the park can help with. They collected all of the data and came up with resilience strategies that were informed and developed by residents in the community, including a lot of young people. Through this project, residents were not only able to increase their capacity to learn how to participate in resilience planning and implementation, but they were also able to create resilience strategies that meet community needs in a very culturally relevant way. And so the last example I wanted to share is for step 4, which is how do we measure and analyze equity progress? And to do this, it involves regularly evaluating the equity progress in an effort to continuously improve the equity outcomes. This was the hardest step to find examples for. We reviewed several policies and programs, and an equity analysis was missing in almost all of them. However, I did find an effort that I wanted to share. Earlier this summer, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors approved legislation to establish an Office of Racial Equity. And this office will oversee a citywide racial equity plan that outlines strategies to address racial disparities in San Francisco. Each city department would have to adopt an action plan that states how they plan to address racial disparities. And importantly, they're going to have to measure that progress. And to do that, they're going to be creating new types of analysis tools to assess the equity outcomes that they're creating. And so this effort just got approved earlier this summer, so we'll have to wait and see how it's implemented. But I think it's worth keeping this office and the work that they're doing on our radar to see how they develop different tools to assess equity outcomes and whether that analysis can be replicated elsewhere in the work that we're doing. And so that is the last step of these 4. And again, just to summarize, the main takeaway here is that whatever climate adaptation and resilience effort we're working on, these 4 steps can serve as a roadmap to creating meaningful equity outcomes. And while our report in this presentation provided just a few examples, this presentation provided a few examples, you can turn to our full report to learn more about more examples and a lot of different best practices for how to center equity in climate adaptation and resilience policies and programs in each of these 4 categories: goals, process, implementation, and analysis. So that concludes the Greenlining presentation, and I did want to just share how this work connects to APEN's Mapping Resilience report. So the Greenlining report helps us understand how can we design different climate adaptation policies and programs to center and uplift frontline communities. We also need to know who these communities are and where these communities are located. This can help us prioritize efforts in the places that need it the most, in our most frontline communities. And that's where APEN's report comes in. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ami.
Great, thank you, Sona. And excited to share more. So one kind of critical framing to both of our reports is the notion of the climate gap, which many of you may be familiar with. The climate gap underlines the way climate disasters have unequal impacts. And in this way, we think of climate change as a threat multiplier, worsening existing inequalities in health, housing, land use, and economic opportunities. And so this means that those who are most impacted are consistently communities with the least resources to respond. And that's something that Sona also outlined in her presentation. In this current moment, we see how disasters demonstrate the way the climate crisis disproportionately impacts the state's most vulnerable communities. And we want to share some specific examples in California that outline this fact. So first, I want to highlight agricultural workers. Outdoor workers are particularly impacted by extreme weather like wildfires and heat waves. Since many agricultural workers are day laborers and can't afford to miss work, they're more likely to agree to work in dangerous conditions. For example, during the aftermath of the 2017 Thomas Fire, farm workers were forced to work amidst falling ash without protective masks. Many farm workers are also undocumented immigrants who are ineligible for federal disaster aid and thus lack access to economic relief post-disaster. Next, I want to highlight incarcerated firefighters. California's prison population serving time for nonviolent crimes make up nearly 40% of firefighters in California. They can't unionize and are not protected by minimum wage, worker compensation, and other laws. In fact, the state only pays incarcerated firefighters $1 an hour. Formerly incarcerated people are also routinely denied emergency medical technician licenses, which means despite having experience, many cannot become firefighters upon release. Next, I want to highlight unhoused populations. We have seen homeless people severely impacted by various climate impacts, from extreme precipitation and flooding to wildfires. Extreme heat is also especially dangerous for homeless people due to barriers accessing cooling services, water, food, and shelter. And we also know that displacement from disasters like the 2017 wildfires in Northern California are contributing to increased homelessness rates, worsening the existing housing crisis. And finally, I want to highlight rural communities. The California drought worsened already low groundwater levels, contributing to the Central Valley suffering from the most contaminated drinking water in the country. The majority of the region's residents are dependent on groundwater for drinking water, particularly impacting rural, poor, and Latinx communities in the region. So what's the path forward? We must ask ourselves, recognizing this gap, what can we do to address those unique risks, protect those that are most impacted, and create opportunities to thrive? And that is the foundation for both APEN and Greenlining's reports, and ours entitled Mapping Resilience, a Blueprint for Thriving in the Face of Climate Disasters. One impetus for this project is CalEnviroScreen, which we've already kind of named and uplifted. This tool really centered the needs of environmental justice communities in state policymaking. And it's really a model for applying data and decision-making to address the cumulative impacts from poverty and pollution. It should be noted that CalEnviroScreen is not designated to depict climate vulnerability, and therefore it doesn't have indicators related to climate change threats or how communities adapt and cope with the impacts. And that was a gap we were looking to understand further in the pursuit of identifying those communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change. So just a quick overview on what you can find in the report if you take a look at it after this webinar or have seen it already. We start with background on communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change threats, specifically in California, as well as some examples beyond. And a lot of the examples I just highlighted in this presentation are drawn from the report. We also outline key definitions and principles for vulnerability and resilience, really rooted in a social equity lens. Then the heart of the report reviews over 40 existing indicators, data, tools, and frameworks to understand climate vulnerability. It's followed by a section around data limitations and knowledge gaps around where quantitative indicators don't capture key trends and influences around vulnerability. It also includes a section on lessons learned from the use of indicators in related fields, namely CalEnviroScreen. And then finally, it closes with the anticipated uses and policy applications of climate vulnerability indicators. So I'm going to just highlight a couple key recommendations that are highlighted in the report in the executive summary, and really are the takeaways from this landscape analysis and report that we put together. So one, climate vulnerability should be assessed by region and climate threat. We know that climate change impacts on communities vary across the state based on biophysical setting, climate, and jurisdictional factors. For example, threats from sea level rise are specific to California's coastal communities. There are also unique population characteristics in rural versus urban areas. Therefore, these types of regional variations caution us against making statewide measurements and comparisons. And instead, we should be considering climate vulnerability at the largest scale by region, and really based on specific climate threats since they're so unique. And when possible, more granular scales, such as at the community level, are preferable. This type of regional lens supports the application of the data since much of land use planning as well as infrastructure development occurs through regional or local policy making. And just on next slide, although there are myriad of exposures, the climate threats covered in this report include wildfires, drought, extreme heat, and flooding, both from extreme precipitation and sea level rise. So based on our review, we see a varied landscape of existing frameworks by scope and quality. Some are specific to distinct climate impacts, while others are more comprehensive and depict interacting factors. We found that there are relatively few approaches that combine multiple factors into one single framework to really think about this issue from an intersectional lens. And based on this analysis, 4 statewide frameworks really stand out in regards to comprehensively integrating multiple exposures, population sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And those are highlighted on the next slide. And they include the California Healthy Places Index, which includes the Climate Change Health Vulnerability Indicators, California Energy Commission Social Vulnerability Climate Change Report, and the Climate Change Vulnerability Screening Index, which is developed by researchers in California. There's also 2 other impact-specific frameworks I want to highlight, which include the Climate Heat Assessment Tool, or CHAT, as well as Climate Central's Surging Seas Risk Zone Map. And it's important to note that although 3 of these frameworks have been developed by California agencies with the intention of informing planning and action, they don't appear to be in broad use at this time. Next slide. So based on this abundance, one of the central recommendations is that researchers do not need to develop new climate vulnerability indicator sets. There is an existing rich volume of frameworks that identify the areas and populations most impacted by climate threats. And in fact, there's significant redundancy of indicators used across the frameworks. And so we assert in our report that there's enough data, indicators, and methods that tell us what the relevant factors are contributing to climate vulnerability of communities. And so there's not an imminent need for a whole new set of indicators to think about this issue. However, a centralized platform is still needed because this type of comprehensive framework connecting the social vulnerabilities with the climate science hasn't been fully realized. And really, what we found is that there's a lack of consistency across the multitude of frameworks. And 40, like I said, we reviewed over 40, isn't even exhaustive. And there really isn't one single set of indicators that exhaustively captures and represents the interactions of those factors in their contribution to vulnerability. And I think the key point is that the availability of so much data and so many tools is leading to paralysis of action. And we assert that policymakers would really benefit from a streamlined, actionable framework that compiles key indicators into a single interface, very much complementary to CalEnviroScreen. This platform would include indicators for exposure, like the ones that I named. It would include indicators for population sensitivity, such as poverty, linguistic isolation, elderly, and disability. And it would also include neighborhood characteristics that reflect adaptive capacity, like tree canopy, vehicle access, and medical facilities. And it would do some of the work to populate the relevant indicators based on the climate threat of interest. And I think it's important that the work ahead really requires us to complement this type of platform and pursuit of a strong data platform by a policy framework that identifies the programs, issues, and policies that can be pushed through the application of the data. And I want to close with the last recommendation, which is that mapping alone doesn't tell the full story of the way communities experience climate change impacts, nor does it tell us the opportunities and existing work that's happening around building resilience. And so we know that there are limits in data collection that imply that there are many relevant factors that are either overlooked or reflect inaccuracies. And so, for example, there are lots of socioeconomic indicators and vulnerability factors that exist, but fewer around adaptive capacity, whether that be around access to transportation, where cooling centers and evacuation shelters are, among other factors. And there's also certain data limitations that mean that certain climate impacts like drought vulnerability and indirect air quality impacts aren't well quantified. That we also name some health outcomes like infectious diseases and mental health outcomes, as well as socioeconomic factors like informal workers, undocumented immigrants, and homelessness that are all trends and factors that the data doesn't capture well. And so that recommendation really tells us that public officials should ground truth and complement mapping with community expertise. Vulnerability mapping is helpful in targeting and prioritizing efforts, but we should really avoid relying on any single data framework to identify and capture all the factors. And therefore, we can complement information derived from the data with experiential knowledge and community stories. And that can happen through ground truthing as well as community engagement processes. And this really ensures that our public processes involving mapping are inclusive and participatory. And so I want to close with the important point that data is powerful. And it can depict the interactive and cumulative impacts of climate change. And it allows us to really operationalize this important piece of addressing underlying systemic inequalities alongside growing climate threats. And that was a point that I made earlier. And I think the data depicted in the way we frame that looks at it intersectionally can really start doing that in a way that makes sense to policymakers. And so the opportunity here is that we can identify vulnerable communities for the sake of targeting resources, services, and projects coming down the pipeline through both regional and state policymaking. And so I'll leave you all with a quote that I think summarizes our kind of thinking around vulnerability, that it's a consequence and not a condition. Conventional approaches to adaptation and mitigation view vulnerability as a characteristic or condition of groups of people and not as a circumstance or consequence of the way social groups have been historically and systemically marginalized and excluded from opportunity. As a result, the policies and practices that have been brought to bear don't address the underlying historical roots of vulnerability. These views exclude these groups from having a voice in setting policy priorities or allocating resources to address these issues. And the key point is that rather than being viewed as victims to be protected and saved, vulnerable communities should instead define, develop, and drive the solutions. And I think that point, both of our reports really kind of underline and and push for it through various strategies. And so with that, I will close on the mapping resilience presentation, and we can move to for the last 15 minutes around questions. Oh, and that just kind of highlights where, just the links to our reports in case folks want to take a look more deeply.
Awesome. Thank you so much, ladies. I'll be sure to include those links as well as part of the follow-up. But yeah, let's go ahead and move into Q&A. So as a quick reminder, feel free to submit your questions through the chat or Q&A portal, or if you would like to use the hand raising feature, we certainly encourage that, and I can unmute you. We do have a couple questions coming in. One from Alexandra. Can you please share a bit more about what ground truthing means?
Yeah, great question. So this is something that we've seen in various data efforts, but I'll name when Kyle and ViroScreen was being developed, researchers had organized workshops to bring in community residents and community-based organizations to review the maps and really start verifying and reflecting their experiences and expertise on whether that data was accurately capturing the factors and the trends that that neighborhood was characterized with. And so what ground truthing is really about is having that personal expertise kind of verify and tell us, yeah, was this accurate? Is what this mapping is telling us in terms of hotspots or the issues that are affecting you accurate to your lived experience? And so it's kind of a comparison, but it allows us to make sure that we're not just relying on data alone, but really complementing it with community experience for folks that actually live there in the everyday, because we know that sometimes data can be inaccurate or is biased based on the way it's depicted. And Julia, you might be muted.
Oh, thank you for that. I'm just talking to myself over here. Thanks, Tommy. You have another question. In terms of pace, do you have any suggestions for how we balance the urgency of action with the time we know it takes and should take to build authentic relationships with community members?
Thanks.
I can
Go ahead.
definitely start with that, and then Ami would love to hear from you since you work more closely with community members than Greenlining does. I think for us, we hear that a lot, that, yeah, with all of these climate disasters, there is an urgency of action, and at the same time, we want to build true, meaningful, like, trusting relationships and partnerships with communities. And I think what we've learned in our experience, and again, Greenlining is not a community-based organization, so I would defer to or the other organizations like APEN to hear from them. But what we've seen and heard is that, yes, it does take time to develop those relationships and to build true trust. But once that relationship is developed, it becomes so much easier to advance the work moving forward. And so for us, it is critical that we do take the time to build these relationships and to really hear from communities, because we're not only getting their input and expertise, but also helping build their capacity to continue doing this work forward. And the more and more we practice that, the easier it'll get to continue partnering and collaborating with different community groups moving forward.
Thanks for that. I would just add, I think that what Sona outlined is exactly right. And we, this has come up in a variety of different contexts, this question about kind of the imminence and the time that it takes to, you know, be organizing, building power, and establishing these systems that allow us to be really centering communities in this work. But I think it's important that we really value that we take the time to do it right. Because if we don't take that time, we might have to come back in it, whether it was, you know, the implementation of a program or the outlining of a policy, where if it's not centering those values and doesn't take the time to you know, create those processes, then you're inevitably perpetuating those same underlying inequalities that are contributing to the crisis. And I think in a place like California, the climate crisis intersects and intertwines with the housing crisis and growing economic inequality, that if we're not thinking about those things together and designing solutions in a way that, again, it may take more time to be holistic, we're kind of either, again, worsening some of those crises and impacts, whether that be displacement or economic disenfranchisement, or we're either worsening them or just not addressing them at all. And those aren't the things that are directly, impacting communities. Communities are experiencing all those things at the same time. And so I really think the imminence of this, it's not away from us, but we have to take time. We're in the long game of organizing, building power to undo these harms that we talked about.
Awesome, thank you both. We have another question coming in from Jacqueline. How do we get policymakers to move from steps 1 and 2, goals in the vision process, to step 3 on implementation? This seems to be where momentum has typically stopped for climate adaptation measures and planning.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. And that's definitely one that we are grappling with as well. I think for us, the implementation is key. No matter how good the goals or process of an effort is, if it's not implemented with equity at the center, it won't lead to the types of equity outcomes that we want to see. And I think we're beginning to see programs like Transformative Climate Communities, where there is that strong emphasis on equity in the goals of the program and in the process. There's extensive community engagement and partnerships that have to be a part of it. And all of that leads into the implementation of the on-the-ground projects that are working to build community resilience in a number of ways. And so for us, I think using that program as an example to show to our policymakers this is the type of program and the benefits that we want to see on the ground is really helpful, so that we can begin to, while planning is really important, it has to lead to action. And so we want to really make sure that we're moving from planning and data and science into something actionable. And so the more and more that we're able to share models and examples of successful projects, I think it really builds the case for this is possible. We've seen it happen and we can continue doing it moving forward. And I'll just share that in our report on the section for step 3 implementation, we have a lot of really great examples and best practices on how to move from goals process to actually implementing whatever the effort is supposed to be.
I think that's exactly right. And I would just underline, I do think having a program that's doing well in terms of implementation and being able to point to it tangibly for policymakers seems like a way that they can really start believing that, oh, it's possible and this is what it could look like. And so that type of modeling, that type of model program in California, the Transformative Climate Communities, has been really helpful. And I think one that I would just add is the Solar on Multifamily Affordable Housing Program, or SOMA. APEN has been involved both in the passing of that policy to get solar on affordable housing, and it's $100 million for putting up panels in this important housing sector. That not only did we pass in policy, we were involved in the rulemaking at the PU's Public Utilities Commission, but really it's about the on-the-ground implementation that we're working on now to actually deliver those projects locally. And I just want to name that it took a lot of work and intentionality and time to operationalize that value around community-based organization like APEN being involved in implementation, and we're a subcontractor to do tenant organizing and outreach for the program. But that's not how often state programs go, where they value CBOs being paid subcontractors to get the word out, to involve tenants. And I think that's how we're going to see success in the program, because of that the time taken to involve us and formalize that partnership and involvement of CBOs. So I just want to offer one tangible example. We still have yet to see the projects, but we have a paid staff member now that's actually really focused on that implementation phase to see, hopefully in a couple years, the delivery of panels on the housing that our members live. And so it requires some investment too, in paying and offering the resources in that phase.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. We have a few more questions. Let's see how much we can cover before the end of the webinar, and we'll share Sona and Ami's contact information again in case you missed it as part of follow-up, so you can follow up with them directly. So another question, are you aware of any resident advisory boards or other structures that help to shift decision-making power to the community that could serve as a model for other parts of the state?
Yes, and I think, I'm forgetting, is it Measure AA? I think APEN is actually on that for the Bay Area local measure to help build the resilience of the coast and help it adapt to sea level rise. I think that is an example that we reference in our report, and I believe APEN and some other groups are on that advisory board. And I think the question is really getting at, like, are there these types of models that exist? And there are, and again, our report references several different advisory groups and different programs and policies that currently exist. And our report also provides, like, not just that we should have a community advisory group, but what should that group be in charge of? How do we shift decision-making power and influence so that the members are not simply serving in an advisory role, but are really able to shift I guess, influence the direction that the effort is going in, and to make sure that their perspectives are valued and heard and are reflected in the different efforts. And so, yes, Measure AA I think is one good example of that. And there are a couple other ones, I'm blanking on them right now, but I would definitely refer to the report to see which other programs and policies have those different community advisory boards.
Awesome. I would also point folks to the Clean Energy Fund from Portland. They have a great resident advisory board type of structure set up. Okay, another question. You mentioned there's already a lot of data out there, but in terms of empowering communities, local granular data is what's most helpful. Do you feel that there is enough local data about climate impacts or health impacts, or do you see any critical gaps that need to be addressed?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's really a limitation. Sometimes in reviewing some of these maps, to kind of hone in on that neighborhood level scale is challenging, because a lot of the data available at the most granular scale is available at the census tract level, which we talk about in our report. There are pros and cons to that. Census tract is still, more sort of granular than, at a regional or more like a county level, for example. But we have community groups that feel like the census block level is more kind of relevant and more applicable to the work at the scale that they're doing. And so there are challenges. And I will say that that community level data, although there is work like, for example, AB 617 is generating community air monitoring data to get us more accurate local kind of reflections of air quality impacts. But I think on the kind of health and climate change side of things, that's kind of being done so in a less, it's a more disconnected process. So it depends. Different institutions have that data on medical facilities or where evacuation centers are, and so the cities and counties may have some of that data on cooling centers, et cetera, but I haven't found a centralized place that, for me, for example, living in Alameda County in Oakland, I could get a sense of all the different resilience facilities and opportunities there are for me in the context of a heat wave or a wildfire or with air quality. So I'd say that it's still a gap, but something that we should be working on at more of the local and regional levels.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ami. Since we have just 1 minute left, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I know that there are still a few questions that we have yet to answer, but again, we'll share contact info so that folks can get connected to Sona and Ami. So just to move into the close, just wanted to thank you both, Ami and Sona, for joining us today. That was hugely informative for me, and I hope it was just as informative for folks who joined us. Huge thanks to our participants for joining us as well. Clearly, these are really important conversations. We know that we're all really busy, and for you to be taking an hour out of your day to join us is, yeah, it was great to have you join us. So please stay tuned for the webinar recording and the presentation. We hope you can also join us on December 4th from 2:30 to 4 is when we'll be working with Cal OES to highlight the new APG 2.0 for some additional comments and feedback. And with that, I think we can go ahead and wrap up this learning session on time. Thanks everyone for joining us. And again, thank you, Ami and Sona, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye now.